Elena Kagan's nomination by President Obama. The first question you have to ask, is this someone that the Republicans should filibuster? My answer is no. I don't believe she should be filibustered. I was in the Gang of 14. You might remember that. There was a time several years ago when Democrats were routinely filibustering Bush appointees. We couldn't get any conservative judges out of the Senate. 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans came up with a way to break the filibuster. We agreed among ourselves that filibusters would only be used in extraordinary circumstances, where the person wasn't qualified or the record was clear they were a judicial activist rather than a mainstream judge. You expect a liberal to pick a liberal, a conservative to pick a conservative, as long as they're qualified and they were not going to wear the robe to become a politician themselves. We were going to let the nominations go forward. I think that's a good standard for the Senate. Senator Kyle from Arizona, a good friend of mine, has indicated that he thought there would be no filibuster. Elena Kagan is clearly liberal. She comes from Harvard. She has a liberal background, but she's also someone who is very bright, has a lot of public support from Republicans and Democrats who've known her and worked with her. So I don't see an extraordinary circumstance at this point in time that would justify a filibuster. Now what I'm trying to do is get the Senate back to sort of the old way of doing business. Alito and Roberts were 2 great conservatives. The Gang of 14 broke the filibuster. Alito and Roberts are on the Supreme Court today because we went back to the old way of doing business. We had a bunch of conservative judges that came out of the Gang of 14. Now here we are with Democrats in control. And when I told my colleagues back during the Bush years about changing the rules, Republicans were ready to change the rules because they were frustrated. I said, what would happen if you get a liberal Democrat in a liberal Congress? Would you want to give up your right as a minority to stop some wildly liberal judge from sitting on the Supreme Court? And I am glad today that we had that right. And there are 1 or 2 Obama appointees that I would be willing to say no to and possibly filibuster. But Elena Kagan, in my view, comes from the mainstream left of center judging. Miguel Estrada, a man who was treated very poorly, a great conservative lawyer who was nominated to the bench and withdrew his name because of all the problems we had with the filibustering of Bush nominees, was in law school with Elena Kagan and has nothing but great things to say about her as a person, her intellect and her reasoning. What they did at Harvard to deny military recruiters access to law school, I didn't like. I don't appreciate it. They changed their policy after they lost in court, but I don't believe Elena Kagan hates the military. She appointed a lot of conservatives to Harvard to kind of balance out the law school, so there's certainly somebody I wouldn't have picked, and that's the point here. Elections matter. So the next time in 2012 we have an election, I want people to understand that the Supreme Court is really in play. Elena Kagan would be replacing Justice John Paul Stevens, a real liberal justice. So there's not going to be a change in the balance of court if she gets nominated and confirmed by the Senate. But a person like Justice Kennedy is sort of the swing vote on the court now. If something happened to one of the conservatives, I would want a conservative president replacing them. So in 2012, people who are really concerned about the Supreme Court ought to make sure that a Republican conservative can be nominated that will beat President Obama, because President Obama will continue to nominate liberal judges. My belief is the Senate should respect elections. If the person's qualified and is not a judicial activist, we ought to understand elections matter. Scalia, a great conservative, Justice Scalia, got 90-something votes. Ginsburg, a liberal in the true sense of the word, but a qualified, honorable person, got 90-something votes. That's the way it used to be. And at the end of the day, I don't want the judiciary, that independent branch of government that referees fights between all of us, to fall to political demagoguery. And Elena Kagan is someone I wouldn't have chosen, but I do think is qualified. And we'll see what happens in the next week or 2 as to how the Senate reacts to her.